Why, Timber? Because we like you.
If it wasn't for day rape, I'd never get laid.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the much anticipated and much delayed 5th episode of Ask Primal. I'm not going to get to everybody's questions because I don't really feel like recording a 30 or 40 minute video, but I plan to get to the best ones. I plan on doing several of these, so if I don't get a question that you like, feel free to ask it again. So let's get to it. No, there is not a nightly meeting. What we mainly do is we communicate through a ST forum. We also communicate through PMs online. We talk over G-Talk. Steph, of course, and I, of course, live together, so we can ask direct questions to one another, and we can do things like that. But really, we coordinate pretty well. We talk to people on the phone on occasion, but there's no real big meeting. We do have kind of a hierarchy going, but majority of how we run things is based on trusting our STs and staff and backing them up. And generally, that means we don't have to micromanage. And there might be STs that are in charge of very specific plots, but there's not like a huge hierarchy deal going on. We may return to New Corsica in a visit. We've certainly seen characters from the previous Chronicle show up, and from the previous Crescent City Chronicles. But I'm a firm believer that when stories run their course, you should leave them alone. You shouldn't pull a George Lucas and mess with them after they're finished. That's not the way to go about things. I don't think I'll ever start a New Corsica campaign. It would kind of almost be disrespectful to all the stories that came there before. It's run its course. Now, I'm not opposed to having characters show up from previous games and that sort of thing, but I don't think we'll ever really be returning there. There's so many other things that we could be doing. This is really an invitation to tell the big, grand story of the beginning of Sanguinus, and that's a really complicated story. It, of course, started out when me and Steph were playing on Diablerie, which was another VTM server. I left it because I did not like that game very much. I did not like the staff. Well, I didn't like the staff who were running it when I left. There were some good people, but they stepped out of the limelight. And I was gone from it for a very long time. And then Vampire the Requiem came out. And Diablo went whole hog for that and went over to that. And in the aftermath of that, after a few weeks of playing VTR and coming to the conclusion it wasn't a very good game, me and Steph hatched the idea of doing a VTM server, and I had no idea what I was doing as far as the technology went. There was a lot of learning. There was programming Archon for the first time, and there was figuring out what setting I wanted to do it in. And the Corsica actually existed before any of this happened. It was a LARP setting that I'd used once or twice, and I wrote up everything I could, invented a whole bunch of stuff for that. New Corsica took its current form. And really, at the very beginning, we maybe had 6 consistent players. But as word got around, especially amongst the old Diablerie base, people started coming here. And you start seeing a lot of the really old souls that have been with the game from the very beginning start showing up. And there were some really tough times. We got accused of basically stealing everything by two other games which were closely associated, Diablerie and another one whose name escapes me at the moment. But after that, after we got established, after people, these other people who are now running VTR realized that we were running a VTM game, and we really weren't trying to compete. We were just trying to make a place where people could play Vampire the Masquerade in a dedicated IRC server environment. But in the first year, there was a lot of tough lessons about how to run the game. There was a lot of disputes, and I mainly found myself drawing from my experience running live action games in order to resolve the kinds of differences that occur in an IRC game, because there's very little from tabletop STing that you can transfer into running a big game like this. LARPs are the closest thing there are, and that involves managing a lot of people with a small amount of staff and getting things done that way and maintaining the right community. Because really what I was setting up was not just a game, but we're a community that is based on certain principles. And many of those principles continue to this day. The fact that we don't censor people, the fact that we talk to them with respect rather than stomping on them, and the assumption that you are all adults until you prove otherwise. And several people have proven that otherwise, and it's always been a tough time when they've done so. But I wouldn't say I went into this a complete noob, but I went into this with a lot of lessons that needed to be learned. And, you know, some of those lessons have been pretty hard. Some of those lessons have been things where I lost people I thought were friends over, and those were really tough. But, you know, some of the people I thought I lost as friends have come back and we've reconciled with, and all in all, I'm pretty happy that I started the games. Except during court. In court, I regret it. Because there's too many posts. What you're describing is really a classic problem. It's when you have the very, very powerful the very, very powerful PCs versus the new PCs. And the two things that I recommend for dealing with that is always have a great deal going on in a storyline, and never have it be that you're looking for a specific conclusion to it. Don't have it so that you have a big goon that you have to fight at the very end of the plot, because that really is the worst kinds of stories, the ones that have this anticipated, expected climax that involves a boss fight. And I've never liked those, and I've always tried to avoid running them. If you see games more as setting up an environment with groups that have goals and have interests, then every player at every level should be able to interact with them without much trouble. You really have to find a balance between making it so that you're not rewarding obsessiveness and doing nothing but playing the game, but you're also rewarding people for actually getting involved. So the secret is that to reward any level of involvement, any level of trying within a person's limitations, but at the same time, if they get upset and don't get involved at all, even though it was a fair situation for their characters to get involved in, then, I mean, they kind of made their bed with that, and that's the end of it. You can't cater to people who don't want to get involved and then listen to their complaints that they don't get enough. So you need to keep approaching people and giving them the correct amount of feedback, but you can't cater to people who complain when you give them attention. I don't think I'll ever run an IRC game of Victorian or Dark Ages or another time period. And I'll tell you why. I really do prefer for large games for them to be modern day. Because everybody is an expert on modern America or modern Europe if they happen to be European. Not as many are experts on Victorian Europe or experts on Dark Ages Italy or Renaissance Milan or Paris in the 18th century. So when you have a large number of players who are not necessarily interested in reading 500 pages worth of decent reference work, what you end up with is kind of a parody of those time periods. And I mean, it's not helped by the White Wolf products are based on a lot of assumptions. So you basically get a mimicking of the movies about that time period rather than that actual time period. And as a person who really likes veracity, I mean, I'm the kind of guy that I played a Semitic once and I ended up reading like 3 or 4 books on voodoo before I even crossed the threshold. I don't really like running those settings. Now, I do like Victorian Vampire. I think it's a very good setting for Vampire. I don't like the Dark Ages. And it's simply because it's boring. It's a really boring time period. Nothing is really happening during the Dark Ages. It's called the Dark Ages because literally we don't know what went on during them, and nothing much did, other than a bunch of people carving out empires with a sword and basically being a bunch of thugs. So every single time I've seen Dark Ages run, it usually ended up being vampire D&D more than anything. So to run a historical campaign, you have to find people with a great appreciation of the history of it, or at least who are willing to develop an appreciation. And with a game with 30 or 40 people, it's really hard to put that expectation. I think it is an unreasonable expectation. And I would only run such a game with people who are honestly interested in some sort of historical veracity for that specific time period. And it would end up being a small group of people. And that's the only way to really do that. You can't have a real cohesive feel for what it is to be on a street in ancient Rome until you have a GM really setting the scene for you and correcting you when you step out of line and trying to avoid anachronism or trying to avoid complete inaccuracy. And also, one thing that I've noticed when I played in historical games, not just for Vampire, but for any sort of setting, whether in live action or tabletop and all that, people are not prepared to deal with the way people in other time periods thought. Because for most of human history, human life was cheap, misogyny and racism was common, and you didn't see a real respect for human life at all. Slavery was rampant, and for the most part, most people's lives were ugly, brutish, and short. And whenever you see anyone try to play a historical game, they want to play the small groups of people who did not deal with that. And those small groups of people make up such a hideous fraction of the population that it really becomes very jarring if you try to depict a medieval city as it actually was, or the nobles as a bunch of thugs, which they mostly were. And people come in with so many preconceptions, mainly from films, about what those periods are really like. And as a history buff, if you try to depict what those periods were really like to live in, most people are turned off by that. So you either have to water it down, which I'm not going to do, or you have to put very high expectations on the players, which I think is unreasonable in our kind of environment. I've always had a soft spot for playing NPCs that people go, oh, fucking shit, when they enter the room. So currently my favorite NPC is Thomas fucking Burke. That is his official middle name, by the way. Other characters I've liked, I do like the trickster aspect because it allows me to engage any type of PC. I've liked Ophis. Louis was fun to play too. Mainly because his talent for understatement and for telling you what he actually meant without ever actually saying it. So he was fun to write for. Captain Roberts was a lot of fun. To pull one that's shown up in Cape Glory. And there's a lot of cool stuff going. There's a lot of cool NPCs. Maxwell, which probably no one remembers, was a lot of fun. And he came and went pretty quickly, though. He really should have. He was knucking fuds. As far as what other types of games I like running online, I really don't think there's many games that I could run in real life that I wouldn't run online. So, I mean, look at my previous video for my favorite kinds of games. I like running Downfall. I would like to revisit Free Space or Trinity's Children at some point, which are my GURPS space and superheroes game. I generally run GURPS because it allows me to do whatever I want, which is always nice. And it's really an easy system to run. The character creation is kind of iffy, but once you get the characters made, and luckily there's some really good programs for just making them, you get a pretty versatile set of things that you can do with it. I'd love to run a cyberpunk game at some point. I also like Call of Cthulhu. I've run that a few times, and I think I'm going to be enlisted to do that when we get company sometime this year. Yeah, I tend to go for stuff, though, that's a little bit more understated than Vampire. Even Trinity's Children, it was a superheroes game, but it wasn't a real big, running around in big capes sort of thing. So I like to run things with a little bit of realism in it. Not too much so that it overrides any of the fantastic or ultra tech elements, but with just a little bit of bite and a little bit of dirt in them, if that makes any sense. Oh, about 3, 4, maybe 5 times a day.
Even your face.
Yeah, I mean, I run side games off and on all the time. I had Trinity's Children, I had Free Space, I had a few one-shot sort of games that just came out of nowhere. I don't think I'm ever going to run anything like D&D, because I don't think that translates into text well unless you have some sort of program for dealing with a game table or anything like that. But I have, as the bug bites me, I'm sure I'll run other stuff. Call Cthulhu, and like I said before, I tend to lean towards GURPS because you can just do anything you want with it, as opposed to more specific systems like Rifts or something like that. Idiots. One of the biggest secrets of developing a character concept that actually works is that you don't actually outline a full history, and you feel free to improvise parts of your history so that you can get involved with the players. Now, you don't want to metagame. You don't want to go too far where you simply say that, well, I happen to know your child, without really talking to the other player and not making it so convenient that it serves some icy end other than getting involved. But if you let your history flow in and be filled in during play to make it a interesting part of the story and relevant, that's a big trick that you can do. Another good thing involving a character concept is you want to avoid the dark loner. That these characters that are like Strider that sit in the middle of everything and don't do anything and aren't extroverted and hate everyone and and are nothing but combat monkeys. These are the worst types of characters. A webcomic I like describes them as murder hobos, which I think really fits. They're awful characters. They have no expression. They're like forbidden by their very character concept from expressing anything. And they have no weakness, which makes stories about them really, really boring. A word about murder hobos and their kin and people who want everything to go right about their character. What the hell are you doing? Every single character that ever amounted to anything in fiction, their lives are tales of failure. I mean, they go through hideous strife. Luke Skywalker has the only parents he's ever known murdered, his home taken away from him, and everything he ever owned he has to either give up or sell. If you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones does not succeed in that movie at all. He doesn't even get the Ark back. He just watches Nazis melt. That's his victory. The Almighty God wins for him after he gets the shit beaten out of him, and he really never succeeds at anything. Characters that never experience strife or downfalls are not protagonists, because a protagonist is defined by a character which is forced to change by the story. And if you go into a story expecting your character never to change and never get involved with anything, what are you doing? What is the point of what you are doing? That's a serious question. You're not playing a character in a story at that point. You're playing this static thing. And I get it a bunch from players that they, well, you're violating my character concept. And I'm like, that character concept existed at the beginning. That character concept should not remain the same the entire time. A character does not adapt or change is better damn well be an antagonist. It better be provoking change in others. And that's mainly the role for NPCs. So what the hell are you doing if you're not experiencing strife and struggle? Whether social struggle and strife, physical struggle and strife. If you never lose in a game, you're a boring character. You're dull. And I don't think anyone here wants to be dull. The chance that a PC will be able to recover a character from Crescent City or New Corsica is actually pretty slim. We frown heavily on that, mainly because once it gets back to those stories been told. And there's only been one time when I personally authorized a non-ST to revive a PC character, and that was in Crescent City when one of the old PCs got pwned by a bunch of Sabat. So the chances of a PC being allowed to play one of their old characters is pretty slim. And even when STs have brought them in, I've kept them on a pretty short leash. Because I don't want this to be the endless parade of people's previous pet characters.